Faith is the victory we know that overcomes the world.
Good morning. Glad to see everybody this morning. All right, there you go. Glad to see everybody this morning. As most of you probably know, tomorrow is Memorial Day. Now, as someone who was raised in a military family, it was driven home to me the importance of Memorial Day, of remembering those who have gone on before us, who have fought and sacrificed for the blessings, the freedoms that we have in our world today. Now, that being the case, I was thinking about that. We would often, we would run every Memorial Day. There was this run called the Red Dirt Run of Honor. And everybody got some dog tags with the name of a veteran, usually a fallen soldier, that they could run in honor of for that race. And there were people who would just walk the race because they couldn't run it, but they wanted to honor those who had fallen, those who fought for blessings that they never got to see the fulfillment of. Now, with that being the case, I thought I would start with this illustration. On June 6, 1944, those Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy. Nearly 160,000 Allied troops took part in the D-Day landings. And that operation is what opened the way toward the liberation of Western Europe and Nazi occupation. But it did not end the war. I actually watched a movie recently, not that long ago, about this slow crawl into Europe as they desperately tried to clear out those Nazis. It took about 11 months. 11 more months from this historic day that it took of people very slowly walking through Europe. The Germans, they didn't just surrender. They didn't just give up. We actually lost about as many more men through those 11 months trying to clear out the rest of Europe than we did on D-Day. But the American Battle Monuments Commission says the Normandy American Cemetery contains the graves of 9,389 military men dead, most of whom died on that D-Day landings and the operations that followed. Now, when those men were being prepared, when they had the plan, when they were going to go in there, most of them knew that they would not see the liberation of Europe with their own eyes. They knew that there was a good chance that they wouldn't be walking away from that beach, but they chose to fight anyways. Soldiers fight because they fight for what is right, because for what they know is right, and because duty demands it. They fight so that others can live in the freedoms that they have purchased by their sacrifice. Now that teaches us something very important spiritually. Memorial Day is wonderful, remembering our veterans, that's good. But we're here on Sunday to look at Scripture, to look at what God has given us, to look at the sacrifice of our Savior as well. There are servants for God, though, this is what I want us to think about this morning. There are servants for God who will never see the fruits of their labor, who may have worked hard year after year after year and might never see the fulfillment of what they were working towards. Especially we think about parents sometimes with children, right? You work hard to prepare your children for this world, for this fight, but you might not see them fight that fight. There are elders who might have to shepherd congregations through difficult periods of time and never see when those difficult periods become peaceful. There are faithful Christians who will stand for truth, who will fight for righteousness because it's the right thing to do, who will sacrifice for the next generation, and who will inevitably leave this world before that harvest is visible. And that brings us to Moses. Moses did a lot in his lifetime. He stood before Pharaoh. He had to endure the complaining of the people who were telling him, "You're making things worse for us. when he was trying to lead them out of Egypt, he interceded for that same Israel when they had insulted God days after he had miraculously freed them. He received the law from God and inevitably had to lead Israel for 40 years in the wilderness because of their lack of faith. In the end, Moses saw the promised land from Mount Nebo. That's a view there from Mount Nebo. Having brought Israel to the very edge of the promised land, but he didn't get to enter himself. Deuteronomy 34, beginning in verse 1. Deuteronomy 34. And Moses went up from the plains of Moab unto Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, that is over against Jericho. And the Lord showed him all the land of Gilead unto Dan, and all Naphtali, and the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, and all the land of Judah unto the hinder sea, and the south, and the plain of the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees, unto Zoar. And the Lord said unto him, This is the land which I swear unto Abraham, unto Isaac, unto Jacob, saying, I will give it unto thy seed. I have caused thee to see it with thine own eyes, but thou shalt not go over thither. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. Now that sign there, that plaque that you see, actually lists several well-known biblical places. If you look at it, it shows you, there's those lines show you where those places would be. There's Hebron, there's Bethlehem, there's Jerusalem, there's Jericho. This body of water right there is actually the Dead Sea. And just beyond that hill country in the distance is the Mediterranean. From Mount Nebo, Moses could see just about all of the promised land. I imagine that must have been a pretty beautiful moment, but also painful. After all the work that he had done, all of the decades he had spent both preparing and then leading the children of Israel in the wilderness, not because of his own mistakes, but because of their unfaithfulness, and finally he's here. But he doesn't get to enter. He doesn't get to see the walls of Jericho fall. But he is called a servant of the Lord. A faithful life is not measured by whether or not we get to see every result. A faithful life is measured by whether we serve God in our generation, by whether we fought the good fight and trusted God with what came after us. First this morning, Moses bore the burden of leading God's people. Moses' life was not easy up until Mount Nebo. He stood there as a man who had been leading an ungrateful people through a hard wilderness for 40 years. Now that's after fleeing his own home, the luxury of being, Pharaoh's grandson, for the hard life of a shepherd, until leaving that hard life, but albeit peaceful life, to then go and stand against Pharaoh as God's servant. He chose affliction with God's people over the comfort of Egypt. Hebrews 11, verse 24 beginning says, By faith Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to share ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, accounting the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of heaven or of Egypt, for he looked unto the recompense of reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. Moses, first and foremost, is a man of faith. In everything, throughout all that he did, Moses endured, and he did so because he could see something that nobody else could. He saw him who was invisible. Right, now that describes the makings of a good soldier. Moses didn't care what it would cost him. He cared about what was right. He could have turned a blind eye and lived in luxury the rest of his life, but he knew that was wrong. He understood that he had a duty, and he chose the righteous road rather than forsaking that duty. Moses' life was not wasted just because he didn't enter Canaan. Sometimes a faithful servant might die with unfinished business, but that doesn't mean the service was in vain. Because the worth of service is not determined by how much of the outcome we ourselves get to hold in our hands. Moses carried the burden of others. Moses' story shows us the hard part about leadership. We were just talking about leadership in class in Romans. But think about what Moses had to endure. The people constantly murmured against him. They didn't have faith. They even rebelled against him. They resented him so much that they looked backward towards Egypt more than they looked forward towards Canaan. Ironically, even when he came back into Egypt to deliver them out of the hands of Pharaoh, before he had even delivered them, they were already complaining. You're just making life more difficult for us. Stop. Ironically, Josephus, interesting read, right? Extra biblical, not inspired, but Josephus has a story of the Egyptians hating Moses for delivering them from the Ethiopians. Ironically, that's the exact same problem that he was having with the Israelites. Josephus attributed to Gentiles what was actually happening with Jews. Moses is over here doing his best to bear the burdens of others, to deliver these people, and they hate him for it. In spite of all that, when Israel sinned grievously, right? Recall when he comes down from Mount Sinai with the 10 Commandments and he's going to give them the law, and he sees they're all dancing and worshiping this golden calf. And of course, Moses is angry. He breaks the tablets, right? But then, when he goes up to God, God decides, you know what, that's it. I delivered these people. They saw the miracles of the plagues. They saw the miracle of the Red Sea parted, and they still choose not to worship me. They choose to insult me. That's it. I'm done. I'm going to start over with you, Moses. And Moses besought the Lord his God and said, Lord, why doth thy wrath wax hot against thy people, that thou hast brought forth out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? Wherefore should the Egyptians speak, saying, for evil did he bring them forth, to slay them in the mountains, and to consume them from the face of the earth? Turn from thy fierce wrath, and repent of this evil against thy people. Remember Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Israel thy servants, to whom thou swearest thine own self, and saidst unto them, I will multiply your seed as the stars of heaven, and all this land that I have spoken of will I give unto your seed, and they shall inherit it forever. And the Lord repented of the evil which he said he would do unto his people. That's Exodus 32, 11 through 14. Right, Moses was mad too, but he interceded. He pleaded with God on behalf of a people who had never shown him gratefulness, who had never shown him respect. Moses exemplified the spirit of a true servant. Moses didn't serve for his own benefit. It didn't matter what he got. He didn't just lead when things were going well. But at all times, he pleaded for them when they didn't deserve it, because he knew that was the right thing to do. And this is one of the places where Moses points us towards the heart of spiritual leadership. Right? How many people knew that Moses went up to the mountain to plead to God on their behalf? Right? They saw Moses get angry at them. They saw him break the tablets, right? Who would have thought that he went up to that mountain and begged on their behalf? There are burdens that happen very quietly, that leaders have to deal with very quietly, that we might never know. There are burdens in serving God's people that aren't always seen. And it's those quiet burdens that make good soldiers. Those who are willing to do what's right even when nobody else knows. It's the prayers that we pray in private. It's when we're struggling to sleep because we can't stop thinking about the burdens of others and how we can help them. It's when we shed tears over people that we care about who might never know how much they are loved. Moses carried people who did not appreciate him carrying their burdens. And that was the righteous fight. It is righteous to keep teaching even when people are slow to hear. A good soldier doesn't fight because it's easy. He fights because God is worthy, because he has a duty, because it's the right thing to do. But Moses' meekness was not weakness. Numbers 12 and verse 3 says, Now the man Moses was very meek, above all men that were upon the face of the earth. Now we have a funny, I like to say, humble as Moses, right? Because Moses was the author of Numbers. Moses is the one who wrote. Moses, the most humble man, right? But of course we know it was actually the Holy Spirit saying that. Now meekness is a concept that's very often misunderstood. Meekness is not cowardice. A lot of times we have this idea of meekness as the one who hides under the table when stuff's going wrong. But this is Moses who stood before Pharaoh. This is Moses who killed an Egyptian to save his brother. This is Moses who went down and broke the tablets of stone in front of the people when he saw them sinning. Right? Meekness is strength under control. Moses' strength was under God's rule. His leadership, his strength, none of it was self-serving. All of it was for others. Now, if you recall, Exodus 18, 13 through 27, there's a story. It's an account of Moses, and he's trying his very best to judge the people and all of their problems, right? And it says, from the morning unto the evening, he's sitting there and people are bringing him their problems. And he's trying to help them through their problems all day, every day. He's wearing himself out. So much so that his father-in-law comes to him and says, you have to delegate. You have to appoint some other people in order to take some of this burden because you can't carry it by yourself. Now, does that sound like someone who doesn't care? Someone who's willing to wear himself out to the point where he just wouldn't be able to continue anymore because all day, every day, he's trying to help other people with their problems. Do you think Moses didn't have any problems? But he concerned himself with others, with the burdens of others. Moses was not fighting for personal glory. Moses was fighting for others. He belonged to God, and that's why he could serve the people who wounded him. See, a soldier for righteousness needs to have that same spirit. It's not about how well they treat me. I'm going to do what's right because I belong to God. A good soldier needs to be strong enough to stand, but meek enough not to make the battle about himself. We need to care more about the cause than the applause. Now, that's not an easy thing to do. There are far too many people in this world who are willing to continue fighting right up until the point where their pride gets hurt, even if they know truth is at stake. If you know you're going to be praised or rewarded, then you might just keep going. But what if you're not going to get anything? Moses saw what was invisible to everyone else, though. And he endured hardship and fought for what was right, even though there wasn't any praise. Then Moses also saw the promise without possessing it. Now this is where I really want to focus in. Moses got to see Canaan. He got to see the promised land. God showed it to him, but he would never cross over. Moses didn't enter because sin has consequences. Now, Moses wasn't kept out of Canaan because his life was totally worthless or because God just isn't fair. He was kept out because of his own sin. We need to understand that. Numbers 20 and verse 12 says when Moses strikes the rock, right, and he's supposed to say some words for the water to come out, but instead he strikes it. He fails to give glory to the Lord. And God says to Moses and Aaron, because he believed not in me to sanctify me in the eyes of the children of Israel, therefore ye shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them. Right now, we just talked about all the good that Moses did, about how humble Moses was, but even Moses messed up. No matter how good we are, no matter how humble we are, sin is still sin, and it will always be defiling. We can never do enough to earn our reward. Moses' years of service did not give him permission to dishonor God. It didn't overrule his sin. When he sinned, when he messed up, he was still accountable. God's servants are still servants. Our past faithfulness does not authorize us to be disobedient today. Moses' exclusion from Canaan teaches us the righteous cause must be fought in a righteous way. We can't claim to be fighting for God if we aren't fighting the way that God intended. What we do matters, and so does how we do it. But something else that I want to look at, arguably more important, is this. Moses messed up. It was his sin. It was the reason why he couldn't enter the promised land. But he was a real servant with real faith, with real sacrifices, real failure. And in verse 5 it says, "So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab." Even with the consequences of his failure, he still died a servant of the Lord. He may not have been perfect, but he was a faithful servant. We will never be good enough to earn our reward. Right? There's always going to be some point when we mess up, when we fall short. But that does not preclude us from being faithful servants. God doesn't expect us to be perfect. He expects us to be the best that we can be. Now Moses prayed to enter. He pleaded to enter, but he accepted the answer. Now, just because he was a faithful servant doesn't mean he didn't desperately want to enter the promised land. He pleaded with God to enter. Deuteronomy 3, beginning in verse 23, "And I besought the Lord at that time, saying, O Lord, Lord, thou hast begun to show thy servant thy greatness and thy strong hand. For what God is there in heaven or in earth that can do according to thy works and according unto thy mighty acts? Let me go over, I pray thee, and see the good land that is beyond the Jordan, that goodly mountain in Lebanon. But the Lord was wroth with me for your sakes, and hearkened not unto me. And the Lord said unto me, Let it suffice thee. Speak no more unto me of this matter. Get thee up into the top of Pisgah, and lift up thine eyes westward and northward and southward and eastward, and behold with thine eyes. For thou shalt not go over this Jordan, but charge Joshua and encourage him and strengthen him. For he shall go over before this people. He shall cause them to inherit the land which thou shalt see." Now, the first thing that I want to notice is that God didn't just say no. He said, go up onto this mountain. I want you to look at all this land. Look at all this land. This is what I promised. This is what I'm giving them. I'm keeping my promise. And I think that's a beautiful thing. You don't get to enter, but you get to see. This shows us that also then, he says, but charge Joshua and encourage him and strengthen him. Even though God didn't allow Moses to finish the work, he still gave Moses work to do for the man who would. You know, it would have been very easy for someone in Moses' position to get very bitter, to get withdrawn, right? I don't get to see it, so I don't really care if you get to see it. He could have envied Joshua. He could have made the issue all about him. But when God gave him a better assignment, he took it in stride. And God said, go charge Joshua. And Moses did. Faithfulness, sometimes it does mean leading the charge. But sometimes faithfulness means strengthening the next generation who will lead after. Knowing that we aren't going to see the fruits of their work. Right? This is a lesson, once again, parents understand pretty well. Preparing their kids for a life beyond them. Preparing them for the battles ahead. We can charge and encourage and strengthen. And though we might not live to see every battle, or the outcomes of those battles, we can strengthen those who will go beyond us. Sometimes we have to sow, even if we aren't going to be the ones reaping. Sometimes we have to lay that foundation so that someone else can build upon it. A good soldier might not live to see those victory parades later, but he can make sure that another soldier is ready to carry the standard. And so Moses did. He transferred his courage. Deuteronomy 31, beginning in verse 7. And Moses called unto Joshua and said unto him in the sight of all Israel, Be strong and of good courage, for thou shalt go with this people into the land which the Lord hath sworn unto their fathers to give them. And thou shalt cause them to inherit it, and the Lord, he it is that doth go before thee. and he will be with thee. He will not fail thee, neither forsake thee. Fear not, neither be dismayed. Moses chose to impart the courage that had led him through life rather than leaving behind only disappointment. Right? Sometimes it's easy to say, well, it was better back then. Life was better. Everything was just better. It was easier. There's just no hope anymore. Moses didn't sit Joshua down, though, and tell him, these people are a hard and unforgiving people. They're never grateful. They always complain. They will never treat you with respect. It's pointless. Just give up. Think about this for a second. Numbers 21, verse 5. The people complained and said, "Wherefore have ye brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no bread, and there is no water, and our soul loatheth this light bread." Now, you know who that was talking there? That was the second generation. Those were the kids who had never even been to Egypt. And they were saying, wow, it was way better back there. Right? What does that tell you about what their parents were telling them? There were people who had never seen Egypt, but they had been told their whole lives by their parents and their family and their friends that we were better off in Egypt. That everything is worse now. There's no point in this wandering. And that tells us everything you need to know about the generation that came before them. Moses, though, was of that same generation. But instead of choosing to imitate those who had gone on before, he chose to pass on strength and encouragement. He chose to tell them, "Be strong and of good courage. The Lord, He it is that doth go before thee. He won't forsake thee." And that's the message that the next generation needs. That God is with you, so we can have courage. Because Moses may not have been able to go before Joshua into Canaan, but the Lord could. He would, and that was more than enough. Moses died then as the servant of the Lord. Right? It could have said Moses died as a disappointed, jaded, and bitter old man. Because he worked so hard, and these people let him down constantly his entire life. He had to wander for 40 years. He wouldn't have made that mistake with the rock if they had just entered the promised land the first time. But instead it says, so Moses, the servant of the Lord, died. That's what we should want said about us. Faith often dies before receiving everything that it saw. In Hebrews, that hall of faith that we talk about, 11 and verse 13, it says, "These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on earth." Now, I don't know about you, but that sounds a lot like Moses on Mount Nebo. The life of faith is not always a life of immediate possession. Sometimes faith needs to greet things from a distance that it will die waiting for. But they all still died in faith. Faith isn't foolish just because the outcome is in the invisible future. Faith isn't wasted because a servant dies before its fulfillment. We are often far too impatient, wanting these immediate results, and that just isn't how life works. Sometimes we sow, but we don't get to see the harvest. We've probably heard that idea of planting a tree under whose shade we'll never sit in. But if we die in faith, then we do not die in vain. The Lord measures labor different from men. 1 Corinthians 15:58, Paul wrote, "Wherefore, my beloved brethren, be ye steadfast, unmovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, for as much as ye know that your labor is not in vain in the Lord." Don't give up, because what you're doing matters. It's not in vain. It might seem in vain sometimes. Look at what Moses did. He was bringing the children of Israel out of Egypt. He was told that he was going to bring them to the promised land, right? This is what he was hoping for. This is what he was expecting. And then he had to wander for an extra 40 years and die at the gate. Think about Noah, who preached for over 100 years while he was building an ark. But he didn't save anyone except his own family. Think about Jeremiah, who preached for 40 years. And guess what? The people didn't listen. And Judah still fell. Think about John, who was beheaded by a wicked ruler. Think about Stephen, who preached one of the greatest sermons and then got stoned for it. Faithful men and women have spent themselves in service and have gone on to the grave with more grief than visible success. But Paul says, don't worry, your labor is not in vain. It matters. Now, not all selfish labor, right? Your labor in the Lord is not in vain. When we work for the Lord, it doesn't matter if you see the fruits of that labor. That labor matters. God's not going to lose track of it. Moses may not have led Israel to Jericho, but his labor was not in vain. Every Israelite that walked across that Jordan into that promised land walked there because of Moses. The faithful dead still have works that follow them. Revelation 14 and verse 13, and I have heard the voice from heaven saying, Write, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from henceforth. Yea, said the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors, for their works follow them. The grave cannot swallow up the value of a righteous life. Moses may have died, but Israel was able to cross because of him. The law that Moses delivered continues to teach us to this day. Moses' life continues to speak because he was a faithful servant of the Lord. Right? A faithful Christian might leave this world, but his influence will stay behind. Every individual we teach, every prayer that we prayed, every person we helped, that meant something. The memory of the steady faith of a Christian will continue to strengthen others. A good soldier might not see the results of his sacrifice, but his works will follow him. And we know that the final victory belongs to those who finish faithfully. Near the end of his life, as he was about to be beheaded, Paul wrote to Timothy, 2 Timothy 4, beginning in verse 6, For I am already being offered, and the time of my departure is come. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the course. I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, shall give to me at that day, and not to me only, but also to all them that have loved his appearing. And that's the goal. Fight the good fight. Finish the course. He will give us the crown of righteousness. Moses and Paul both teach us something that we desperately need. You know, I'm sure there are things that Paul would have liked to finish here on earth. But he didn't go on to his reward regretting not finishing, because he finished the course. You know, there might be unfinished earthly works, but that does not mean that we haven't completed our faithful life. Our circumstances might be unfinished, but our faithfulness is complete. We might leave behind some problems. We might leave behind some works for others to complete, some battles for them to fight, but we don't leave behind a surrendered faith. And to live a life that courageously fights the good fight. We might not see the culmination of the battle with our own eyes, but we can be assured that victory comes, that crown of life, or of righteousness, will be placed on our heads. If we fight the good fight, we finish the course, and we keep the faith. When Moses stood on Nebo and he saw that land stretching out before him, I'm sure there was a bit of sadness, but I'm sure there was joy also. God kept his promise. And all that Moses had worked for, it was real. That sadness was there, though, because he wouldn't be entering that land himself. You might call it a bittersweet moment. Sometimes we have to endure those. We can rejoice in what God has done, even if we're sad we won't live to see it. We've seen enough to know that God is faithful, to know that we don't need to see that final harvest. And that's where faith rests. A good soldier does not demand to see the whole victory before he takes his post. Every faithful Christian doesn't demand that God explain every single unfinished part before obeying him. Moses saw that land from afar. He died outside of Canaan, but he died as a servant of the Lord. And what better thing could be said of a man? We must serve God faithfully, fight for what is right, because that is our duty. And in the end, we know the land is real. The promise is real, and God is faithful. That tells us that no matter what, whether we see fruits here on earth in our lifetime or not, our work is not in vain. It matters. If this morning, perhaps you've been fighting a difficult fight and you need some encouragement, some strengthening. Moses told Joshua and the rest of the congregation to be of good courage. Be strong and courageous. If you need courage, encouragement, someone to walk alongside you and help carry that burden, we would love to do that. If this morning you haven't started that journey, you haven't got on the course, you haven't begun fighting that fight, now is the time to start. Because that promise is real. And God is always faithful. If this morning you have any need, we would love for you to come as we stand and as we sing.